Welcome to Module 3 presentation, a little bit about commas. As you can see in this little cartoon on the first slide, commas are kind of easily cast aside sometimes or maybe viewed as little unimportant marks that just kind of need to be thrown into a paper. And nothing could be further from the truth. But it is true that a common misconception about commas is that placement is essentially random or up to the writer. And commas do help with the pacing of sentences, but the common misconception that you should put a comma wherever you would pause if you were talking is just not correct. That's not a great way to decide where to put commas. Instead, there are actual comma rules that need to be followed for correct usage. And these rules are laid out in the chapter. There are 6 different rules that are laid out in your chapter. That might sound overwhelming because it's a lot of different types of usage, but once you get into it, you'll see that these rules are actually quite clearly stated. They're easy to understand. And knowing the actual rules about commas should make you feel much more confident, because the reality is when you've been taught just put in a comma where you might pause, that feels very squishy and uncertain because not everyone pauses in the same place. And so it's not a very reliable guide. And so instead, knowing the real rules about commas can help you set some clear boundaries. And as this picture on this particular slide shows, commas are very important, and it says commas save lives. In this case, I like cooking, my family, and my pets. If a comma was added, it would be much more appropriate. I like cooking, my family, and my pets. So that's one particular example. One thing worth knowing that is not listed in your book is the idea of the Oxford comma. The book talks about using commas in a series of items, like a list. And the Oxford comma is one of the official names for the last comma in a series, the final comma. Another name for this is the serial comma. S-E-R-I-A-L, serial comma. An example you can see here in this slide, in the sentence, I bought milk, bread, and juice, you'll see that the final comma before and the final comma in the series is highlighted yellow here. That's the Oxford comma or the serial comma. The Oxford comma is optional. You don't have to use it. And often now it's not used at all by lots of people, particularly in informal writing and journalism. You usually don't see it anymore. It's more standard to not use a comma there. So you won't be losing points if in your essays, for example, if you aren't using the Oxford comma. But one important thing to note is that whatever you decide about the Oxford comma or the serial comma, you should be consistent. So if you decide you don't want to use the Oxford comma, if you don't want to use the final comma in the series, that's fine, but you should do that throughout your paper in every sentence, every time you have a series. It's not good to vary and sometimes use the Oxford comma and sometimes not use it. As you can see from this particular graphic, people can be very passionate about the Oxford comma. It states, you can have my Oxford comma when you pry it from my cold, dead, and lifeless hands. People tend to feel very strongly about this. Very few people are on the fence about the Oxford comma. Either people say it's completely unnecessary and it's a relic of a bygone age, or people tend to feel very strongly that it is definitely still necessary and that everyone should still be using it. And there are reasons for that particular view. The Oxford comma really can make a difference for the meaning of a sentence. And this cartoon here on our last slide is a perfect example. With the Oxford comma, the sentence at the top says, we invited the rhinoceri, Washington, and Lincoln. So a pair of rhinoceroses, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. If the Oxford comma is deleted, now the sentence reads, we invited the rhinoceri, Washington, and Lincoln, making it sound as if those two names are redefining or renaming the first noun, rhinoceri, and we have this kind of hilarious picture of these presidents with their faces on rhinoceri. And that's a silly example, but a really good example to show just how much this matters and how it really can change the meaning of a sentence to not have that last comma in the series, the Oxford serial comma. In fact, there was even a court case that was recently fought in the last year or so over the lack of an Oxford comma in an employment contract. There were a bunch of dairy truck drivers who were claiming that the lack of an Oxford comma in a particular sentence in their employment contract made it clear that they should be paid overtime for a particular task. The dairy company that employed them disagreed and said, no, that's not what was meant in the employment contract. That's not what was indicated, that this particular task should earn overtime pay. And so a judge had to decide. In the end, the judge decided in favor of the truck drivers, saying that the lack of the comma in that sentence really could create the impression that that particular task did in fact entitle them to overtime pay. And so they were granted that overtime pay, and the company had to pay out millions of dollars. So the presence or absence of an Oxford comma or the serial comma really can make a difference in the meaning of a sentence, which is why it's a worthwhile thing to know. And again, it's your choice whether you use it or not, but just know that whatever you decide, you should be consistent and do it the same thing every time, and that the lack of an Oxford comma sometimes can create confusion or potentially humorous sounding sentences.